Hello, Brad Zook here. Years ago, during the first Iraq War, I remember seeing a news report about the Swords of Qadisiyah, I think is how you pronounce it. These are arches that are in Baghdad, and they go over a main road in Baghdad. And you could see the hands that are holding the swords are actually modeled after Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein. Now, what I found really shocking about the sculpture is what you see when you get up close. They piled the helmets of the people that the Iraqi army had killed. Mostly Iranians, many of whom were killed with mustard gas, by the way. So here you have a regime whose policies have resulted in the deaths of thousands, and the regime used a representation of the dead in order to publicly brag about what they had done. I recently bought this magazine on eBay, so now I have my very own copy of this infamous Awake magazine. This magazine is produced by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. This particular issue is dated as you can see, May 22nd, 1994. Today is May 22nd, the year 2014, which means today is the 20th anniversary of this magazine. I realize most of us have seen this cover a million times, but I wonder how many people know what is inside the pages and have actually read it. These aren't just faces. These were real kids who died as a result of the Watchtower's policies to refuse a relatively simple medical procedure known as a blood transfusion. A policy that clearly contradicts the scriptures, as we will see later in this video. The inside cover of the magazine says that it has an average printing of nearly 13 million. So nearly 13 million copies of this thing was made. And this was distributed by the Jehovah's Witnesses to people's homes all over the world. First, I want to say, if you happen to know personally any of these children or these families in this magazine or on the cover, this video is anything but an attack on them. Quite to the contrary, it's a tribute to these young men and women, not as Jehovah's Witnesses, but as people. So let's briefly look at the stories of just the three kids that are featured mainly and prominently in the center of the magazine. The first young man we're going to talk about, you see, is a good-looking young man there in the center. I didn't realize, but his name is Adrian. And Adrian's father says about him, when he was 11, he found 3 young raccoons alongside the highway and took them to school in his book bag. When the teacher came in, the classroom was in turmoil. The children crowded around Adrian's book bag. The teacher looked in, saw the raccoons, and drove him and his pets to a facility that took care of animal orphans. Adrian was in tears at the thought of losing his babies, but after touring the facility and seeing the baby foxes and other orphans well cared for, he left his raccoons there. So it makes me wonder if Adrian might have maybe he went to school for veterinary medicine. Maybe he could have grown up to train service animals for blind people or people confined to wheelchairs, for example. Adrian's mother said he was a very loving boy. The children at school described him as a person who would not hurt anyone, she said. A girl in his class was limited mentally. She rode the school bus with Adrian. Other children made fun of her, but her mother told us that Adrian always treated her daughter with respect and kindness. Then it makes me think maybe Adrian would have grown up to work with developmentally disabled adults. Maybe that could have been his life calling. Maybe he could have been a public school teacher and taught the special education classes. When Adrian was 14 years old, a fast-growing tumor was found in his stomach. The doctors wanted a biopsy but feared excessive bleeding and said that a blood transfusion might be necessary. Adrian said no. He was adamant. He said, with tears in his eyes, now listen to this, "I just could not live with myself if I am given blood." Adrian did not take blood, and he died on September the 13th at the age of 15 years old. Next young person we want to look at is Lene, and Lene's on the left side over here. Lene was diagnosed with leukemia, which is a blood cancer, at the age of 12 years old. And Lene says, "My pediatrician came in and told me he was sorry, but nothing would help me but the chemotherapy and transfusions. He left and said he would be back later. When he left, I started to cry very hard because he had taken care of me all my life, and now I felt like he was betraying me." Lene said, "I have served Jehovah all my life, 12 years. He has promised me everlasting life in paradise if I obey him." The doctors and the lawyer told her parents that she thinks and talks like an adult and is able to make her own decisions. Lene passed away on September the 22nd, 1993. She did not have a blood transfusion either. And the last young person we're going to look at is Lisa. Lisa is on your right side over there. Lisa was also diagnosed with leukemia at the age of 12. The hospital tried to get a court order in order to save Lisa's life. And then Lisa told the judge that she would fight and kick the IV pole down and rip out the IV no matter how much it would hurt and poke holes in the blood. The judge said, Lisa told this court clearly and in a matter-of-fact way, if an attempt is made to transfuse her with blood, she will fight that transfusion with all the strength that she can muster. She has said, and I believe her, that she will scream and struggle and that she will pull the injecting device out of her arm and will attempt to destroy the blood in the bag over her head. The judge went on to say that she has a well thought out, firm, and clear religious belief. And that, my friends, is a clear example of why the public needs to be educated about mind control. The judge denied the court order for a transfusion, and Lisa's family took her home that day. She died at home with no medical treatment. Now, the uninformed might look at this, all these cases, and think, wow, what amazing religious faith and dedication these families have. But is that really the root of this behavior, or are there other forces at work here? Let's listen to the experience of a Jehovah's Witness father who was in a similar situation.
The blood issue in the back of our minds was bothering us because as Jehovah's Witnesses, if we freely gave a blood transfusion to our daughter, we'd be excommunicated, we'd be disfellowshipped. Well, the doctors finally came to our room and it was just like an ultimatum. They said, listen, we know from our records that you're a Jehovah's Witness. We know that you don't take blood transfusions. And the doctor looked me straight in the eye and said, Mr. and Mrs. Blizzard, you have to make a decision, yes or no, whether your child lives or dies. I remember going over to the bed and she had these cords and wires keeping her alive, life support systems, and holding this limp child that was our only daughter, and just going over to the window and looking out and watching the clouds and the sky and just started to weep. And I said, oh God, Jehovah, and I prayed to Jehovah.
We just had a real distinct impression that we were supposed to obey God's law and go by what we had always been taught, and that we were to let our daughter die. And so we just called the doctors back in and told them that we had just had to let her die, that we had to obey God's law.
About a half an hour later, a sheriff deputy came to our room and gave my wife and I both citations, and they told us that a court order has already been issued. Your daughter is going to get the blood, and they also warned the staff of the hospital not to allow us to take Jenny out of the hospital.
And we were charged with child neglect and abuse.
The witnesses, there was multitudes of them that came up to the room, just swarmed the room, tried to giving us Watchtower articles about artificial blood, and you just can't let your child take that blood, and just putting this heavy guilt trip on us. The elders were relieved to find out that there was still time to get Jenny out of the hospital, and they would come up to me and say, "Hey, I've got a plan. We can get her. We can hire a helicopter. We can sneak her out of this hospital. Just unhook the tubes, and we're gone." And I said, "Wait a minute. You can't do that. It's against the law. I'll be charged with murder." They said, "That's a chance you're going to have to take." And I just told them, "Look, I just can't let my child die in that way." And the elders were just so upset. They left in a huff. They were mad. And one of the elders said on the way out, he looked me in the eye and said, "You know what? I hope your daughter gets hepatitis from that blood." And that was just the straw that broke the camel's back. I was just broken here. My own people, God's organization, turning against me, cursing me, because I just wanted to see my child live. And so they left. And we were all alone. Even my own parents didn't come see us.
You see, the elders weren't there for Paul to offer loving counsel and moral support. They were there to make darn sure that the Watchtower's rules were followed. That's basically the elders' only job. Elders aren't spiritual leaders. They are Watchtower muscle. On a slightly different topic before I put this magazine down, on kind of an aside here, I always wondered what else was in the magazine. I always assumed that the entire magazine would be dedicated to these kids. And I didn't realize till I got the magazine, started looking through it, it's only the first 15 pages are dedicated to these kids. So after reading 15 pages of these heartbreaking stories you can't imagine a family going through this, of letting their child die. You would think, what would be the next article that would follow? Would it be some kind of grief counseling for them, maybe? No, the next article that follows, albino alligators. Albino alligators, the very next article. You see on the previous page we have this beautiful young Jehovah's Witness. I believe her name was Ernestine. And the very next page that follows, albino alligators. When I first saw this, your gut reaction is to kind of laugh because it's ridiculous. But then you realize this isn't funny at all. This is how little the Watchtower regards the lives of these children, how little they care about them. And they can talk about the deaths of kids and then follow it with albino alligators. What else is in this magazine? We got something about boyfriends and girlfriends, and oh, here's a great one. Here's a cartoon of somebody falling down on the ice. Oh, look at that. Someone falling down the ice. It says, put humor into your life. Okay, keep in mind, this is the cover of the magazine. 27 dead children. And we have a cartoon of somebody falling down on the ice. There is a time to laugh, the article begins. Well, there are people who have better knowledge of the ins and outs of the blood issue than I do, like the fractions and all that kind of stuff. I really don't have a great understanding of it. There are other people who do. You can check out some of the work done by, I believe his name is Marvin Schilmer. He has a great blog on this. AJWRB.org is a great organization to look up. Mark Latham has also done some fine videos on this issue. I'm going to look at this from a biblical perspective. Now, you may not personally believe that the Bible's true, but the point is, the Watchtower claims to believe that the Bible is true. And as a Jehovah's Witness once told me, nobody follows the Bible better than the Jehovah's Witnesses. Oh, really? Well, let's see. The main verses they always use, one is Leviticus 17:10. In Leviticus 17:10, God commands, do not eat the blood of the animals. This is because God knew it would make them sick. I mean, could you imagine God trying to explain to these early people about bacteria and viruses and invisible creatures that could harm them? No, he just created a law for their protection. Eat the meat, not the blood. Acts 15:28 is the same thing. It's about eating blood that could make you sick. It has absolutely nothing to do with a medical procedure. Those commands are there in order to protect our health, not to harm it. However, just for conversation, let's just assume for a bit that the Watchtower is correct in its interpretation. Let's assume that Jehovah does actually have a law against medical blood transfusions. He doesn't, but let's just assume that he does for conversation's sake. The first account that I want to look at is Matthew, the 12th chapter, Matthew 12. Here's the account. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. Jesus said to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for him to eat, nor those who are with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath, but are not guilty? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. So the legalistic Pharisees were complaining that the disciples weren't following the law. And Jesus told them, look, David broke the Sabbath law, but he wasn't guilty. Why? Because his men were hungry. So which is more important? Legalism or the needs of the people? The next one I want to look at is Mark, the 3rd chapter, Mark 3. Starting right from verse 1. Jesus entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. The Pharisees watched Jesus. They watched him close to see whether he would heal the man on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. Well, doesn't that sound exactly like the situation of that Jehovah's Witness father that we watched? The legalist Pharisees or elders showed up just to watch to make sure that the law wasn't going to be broken. Jesus said to the man with the withered hand, come here. Then Jesus said to the Pharisees, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to harm? To save a life or to kill? But they were silent. And Jesus looked at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart. And he said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him on how to kill him. Again, it's exactly what happened to that Jehovah's Witness father. The Pharisees left, held a meeting on how they could destroy this man because he wasn't following their legalistic rules. Last one I want to look at, Luke 14. Luke 14. It's a similar story. One Sabbath, when Jesus went to dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees, they were watching him carefully. And behold, there was a man before him who had dropsy. And Jesus responded to the Pharisees, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? But they remained silent. Then he took him and healed him and sent him away. He said to them, which of you, having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well on the Sabbath day, will not immediately pull him out? And they could not reply to these things. So Jesus is saying, if your ox falls in a hole on the Sabbath, you obviously break the Sabbath law of not working, and you pull him out. Do you know why? Because despite how some religions try to portray him, God is not a nut. If your son or your ox falls in a hole on the Sabbath, break the Sabbath law and get him out to save his life. So, Jehovah's Witnesses, I have a question for you. Why do your leaders care less about Jehovah's Witness children than Jesus says we are supposed to care about oxen? Which is more valuable? According to Jesus, we're supposed to break the law to save your oxen, but according to the Watchtower, you're not supposed to break the law to save your own child. Now, I've never been a Jehovah's Witness, so you're going to have to explain to me how these rules are any indication of the Holy Spirit's direction. Because from my perspective, it looks like the exact opposite. Bottom line is, Jehovah's Witnesses, you have to leave this organization. To say that Jehovah is the guiding force behind this indefensible nonsense is an insult to God. If you are supporting this organization, you are complicit in all of the tragedies left in its wake. It's time to do the right thing, and it's time to get out. Did you know, as a fact, as a statistic, more people have died following the teachings of this organization than have died following the teachings of Marshall Applewhite of Heaven's Gate, David Koresh of the Davidians, and Jim Jones, People's Temple, combined together? More people have died following the Watchtower's directives than all of those historic cult tragedies combined. And to the Watchtower, you're disgusting. This is disgusting. You are a scourge on the human race. You contribute nothing to the greater good, and humanity will be better off when this organization is gone from the face of the earth. It has been 20 years since the Watchtower Society produced this magazine, and I want to end this video with 60 seconds of silence as a tribute to these young people. Look into the eyes of these kids and ask yourself, what did they die for?